Here we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the psychology of human sexuality. Your textbook briefly describes the work of Alfred Kinsey, who was truly a pioneer in the study of sexual behavior. In fact, there's an entire institute named after him at the University of Indiana, where my friend and co author Justin Garcia is the executive director for. In many ways, Kinsey pioneered the scientific study of sex, which was so much improved compared to Freudian psychoanalysis that we discussed earlier in the course. But I'd like to call attention to two other scholars who also made some historically influential contributions to the field of sex research, and they are Bill Masters and Virginia Johnson. Unlike Kinsey, who used self-reports like interviews to study sex, these folks actually watched people having sex in their laboratory. They actually conducted direct observation of anatomical and physiological sexual responses in their research participants. Their research was critical in establishing basic facts about the physical nature of sexual arousal and orgasm. But we haven't really defined these key terms yet. When we say sex, what is that exactly? Sex can serve as a description of an organism based on biological traits like genitalia. Behaviorally, sex also refers to physical actions involving erotic body parts, such as stimulation of genitals and orgasm. Gender is different from sex in that it involves psychological variables. This can refer to traits, attributes, attitudes, and behaviors associated with masculinity and femininity. Sometimes this is connected to societal stereotypes, like which colors are more masculine, maybe blue, or feminine, maybe pink, for which there is obviously no biological explanation. This is where people get the phrase that gender is a social construct. Sexual orientation refers to the object of a person's sexual attraction. It is widely agreed that sexual orientation exists on a continuum from same-sex attraction or homosexuality to both sex attraction, bisexuality, and opposite sex attraction or heterosexuality. The continuum of homosexuality to heterosexuality, by the way, is something originally discovered by Alfred Kinsey. Your textbook also makes reference to something known as sexual fluidity, which is an important term to know about. There is a strong biological underpinning for human sexuality. That is, genetics and exposure to hormones in utero strongly predict sexual orientation. But it's not like eye color. It's not like something that stays perfectly constant from birth to death. Research by Lisa Diamond has shown that sexual orientation can and often does fluctuate across the lifespan, sometimes as a result of interpersonal relationships or circumstances. Diamond notes that these changes do not appear to be under people's willful control and happen more often in women than in men. Your textbook also includes some discussion about biological and gender diversity. There is the phenomenon of intersex, sometimes in medical contexts also referred to as disorders of sexual development, which means that individuals are born with some combination of biologically male and biologically female traits, including reproductive organs, sex hormones, or sex chromosomes. However, the existence of intersex individuals or individuals with DSDs should not be used to mistakenly conclude that biological sex exists on a spectrum. The diversity in our biology simply indicates that, diversity. It does not mean we don't have a basis to classify people as biologically male or female in nearly 99% of cases. There are dozens of intersex conditions, such as androgen insensitivity syndrome and Turner syndrome. Some intersex individuals may have physical limitations, like heart defects, but otherwise lead relatively normal intellectual, personal, and social lives. The international scientific and medical communities, such as the World Health Organization, view variations of sex, gender, and sexual orientation as totally normal. Furthermore, variations of sex, gender, and sexual orientation occur naturally throughout the animal kingdom. More than 500 animal species have homosexual or bisexual orientations, and more than 65,000 animal species have intersex individuals. In humans, intersex individuals make up about 2% or 150 million people out of the world's population. We also see evidence in humans for gender diversity, that is, identifying with a gender that does not necessarily align with sex assigned at birth. There are potentially an infinite number of gender identities, with some scholars believing there are as many genders as there are people. The most common manifestations of gender diversity include a trans identity, such as male to female or female to male, and non-binary. But does gender diversity exist in other animals? Perhaps so. Primatologist Franz de Waal has written about how young male and female primates develop their gender roles in a similar fashion as humans. They look to adults to learn how to behave. Young males are biased to learning from older males, and young females look to their older counterparts as well. He also describes several instances of adult primates behaving in ways that are characteristic of the other sex. In particular, in a recent book, he described the example of an adult female chimpanzee named Donna. Donna behaved in ways that are characteristically male in terms of things like behavioral dominance and physical intimidation of rivals. But the most striking thing that made Donna stand out was that she also affiliated with the other males in her group rather than the other females. She lived as part of the male chimpanzee society. She showed no interest in mating with the males in her group. She just wanted to live like a male. And they accepted her in that role. Franz de Waal does not go so far as to describe Donna as transgender or transsexual. Perhaps if we knew that chimps had gender identities the way people do, Donna would have revealed a trans identity to us. But of course, we can't know that. De Waal himself wrote, the best way to describe her is perhaps largely asexual, gender nonconforming individual, and in one interview described her as non-binary. She was not sexually interested in any others, not even other females, so we wouldn't classify her as lesbian either. The main conclusion we can draw is that gender diversity exists in humans and in the animal kingdom. Separately, as a primatologist, de Waal ponders why people in any society would be so adverse to this. He says that primate species, like chimpanzees and bonobos, are much more accepting of sexual and gender diversity than humans. But in addition to the fact that such diversity is something we share with other creatures, there is a substantial role for culture in sexual expression as well. This slide shows the percentage of respondents who agree that, quote, sex is beneficial for health and well-being. As the table shows, sex is widely regarded as beneficial, but there's also large cultural variation. And this has likely changed across history as well, with more positive attitudes around the world now compared to several hundred years ago. Here's more data about attitudes towards sex across culture. This is from a 2005 survey with over 300,000 participants in 41 countries. The table shows the age of first sexual encounter, which is on average between the ages of 16 and 20 years in most places, the lifetime number of sexual partners at the time of the survey, which is on average between 5 and 15, the percent of respondents who endorsed having a one-night stand, which varies between 10 and 60%, and those who reported having sex in a car, which is between 10 and 75%. So as you can see, there's lots of cultural variation in sexual expression. Some of the most common sexual behaviors include these: masturbation, or solo sex for self-pleasure. Then we have partnered sex. And here we can discuss coital, oral, and anal sex together. Coital sex is the term for vaginal penile intercourse, which occurs for about 3 to 13 minutes on average, and there's tremendous variation regarding frequency in cultures around the world. For example, the average number of times per year a person in Greece or France engages in coital sex is significantly higher than in India or Japan, although frequency and duration also fluctuate across different age groups. Oral sex includes cunnilingus, oral stimulation of the female's external sex organs, and fellatio, oral stimulation of the male's external sex organs. Oral sex also varies across cultures, but what's even more interesting is that a lot of people don't consider oral sex to be sex. In America, more than 1/3 of college students believe oral sex to be a form of abstinence. Anal sex refers to penetration of the anus, and this is stereotypically associated with male homosexuality, but is definitely not exclusively a homosexual behavior. As your textbook notes, the anus is often experienced as an erogenous zone, both by men and women, and about 40% of heterosexual people, including men and women, report having anal sex at some point in their life. Next, we have sexual fantasies. Aside from behavioral sex, people spend a great deal of time and energy on mental or cognitive sexual experiences, which are called sexual fantasies. We'll talk more about these on the next slide. And finally, we have paraphilias. And I take issue with the discussion of paraphilias in your textbook because I think they're framed in somewhat of a pejorative way. Paraphilias are a very broad category of non-normative sexual preferences or kinks. They are definitely not always considered disorders, and they are definitely not always harmful. If someone has a foot fetish or a letter fetish, for example, these would be considered common paraphilias. Some paraphilias, such as pedophilia, which is the sexual attraction to prepubescent children, are considered disorders, and people who have them often benefit from clinical interventions and therapy. What is and what should be considered a paraphilic disorder remains a hotly contested and debated topic in psychology. Turning back to sexual fantasies, these are incredibly common, and we observe people having them all around the world and across all age groups, including children, who are often very curious about their bodies and about sex, even though they haven't gone through puberty and are unable to experience sex as adults do. Sexual fantasies often serve as a complement to sexual behavior. In fact, the two tend to correlate positively with each other. That is, the more people experience behavioral sex, the more they often tend to fantasize about it. These are some of the most common sexual fantasies, according to research by my friend and colleague Justin Lee Miller, who has a wonderful book on this topic called Tell Me What You Want, and I highly recommend that book. The first is multi-partner sex. So these are things like threesomes, orgies, or gangbangs. Next, we have bondage, dominance, discipline, submission, sadism, and masochism, or BDSM for short. As we talk about BDSM, I want to briefly discuss the phenomenon of fantasizing about forced sex, what are sometimes called rape fantasies. And these are extremely controversial, in addition to being very common. A majority of women, over 60%, and even a large amount of men, over 40%, have reported having a fantasy at least once in their life about being forced to have sex. And about 10 to 15% say it was their most recent sexual fantasy. But this does not mean that all of these people, and all of these women in particular, want to be assaulted. There's a big difference between fantasizing about forced sex and actually experiencing it. There's a great discussion about consent in your textbook, and often people with fantasies about forced sex may want to act out such fantasies in a simulated and controlled way with a partner. This can be combined with BDSM or role play. Open communication and enthusiastic consent are extremely important, central aspects of sexual play, which is the fundamental distinction between sex for pleasure and sexual assault. Some other common sexual fantasies include novelty, which includes things like adventure and variety, such as doing something that's new and different, such as a new sex position or setting. Taboo sex acts, which include doing things that are socially or culturally forbidden. Passion, romance, and intimacy, for example, being emotionally connected with a partner, feeling loved, appreciated, and desired. Being in a non-monogamous relationship, such as swinging, polyamory, cuckolding, or other forms of open relationships. And finally, gender bending and homoeroticism. In other words, pushing the boundaries of gender identity, role, or expression, and sexual orientation.